Hello, I'm Krista McAllister, and welcome to Cerius Leadership. Whether you are growing your business, growing your career, or quite possibly both, thank you for joining us. Today, I am so excited to welcome Christina Karchik, just a seasoned C-level HR leader, global people strategist. And Christina, you really excel at driving employee engagement and inclusive workplaces while keeping the business in mind. I'm so excited to have you today.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited.
So, we've had a number of these discussions in HR. So, you look at that cross section between what people need and the workforce that's really driving it, and what the business needs, and where the two really are aligned in the same thing. We just need to help communicate and stress that. And in the world of HR, it feels like what was true on Tuesday and compliant then is not true and compliant on Thursday. I'm really having a tough time keeping up here. What do you think is driving that?
It's the world we live in. It's ever changing, and the change is happening quicker, and it feels more furious than ever before, right? And you think about the past 5 years, what we've been through as HR professionals. It has truly evolved, but it's not just HR, it's our overall industry. And now, with the introduction of AI, it's turning everything we knew on its head. So, it is quite difficult for HR professionals, but I would say for any professional out there, you have to be quick to adjust with the change because it is constant and it's not going anywhere.
How are you finding to balance that? Because we can be quick to adjust with it, but we have to buffer a little bit because we can't be quickly adjusting and changing. And the policy last week has changed. Now the policy is this. We've got to keep that consistency of communication with our teams. How do we balance that?
You know what? That's a great question. And it's not easy, but I definitely think it's achievable. And it's done, I would say, a couple of ways. Number one, I think the last probably 10 years, I come from the startup world. It's been crazy and we've been very reactive. Um, we've gone through market changes and it's given us a chance to reflect and really think about how do we move this forward with AI and so forth. And some of the things that I think we've been missing is the basic infrastructure to allow us to constantly change. And that's honestly having as simple as an operating model, understanding how we're going to operate so we can be quick and we can adjust without honestly just shaking up the whole organization and constantly creating chaos. So there are definitely ways HR can play in, like, important roles, I should say, HR can play in helping managing this. I think also the other piece as HR professionals, I think we have to dive deeper is understanding our audience and how they process information, how they learn. By doing that, we can really adjust and be able to scale accordingly. When it comes to compliance and those type of changes, I think probably the best thing to do is not automatically react. Really take a look at what we've been doing and what really needs to change, and also waiting till we need to, and just planning. It all takes, having that open communication with legal, but also understanding when we have to really have that react and just minimizing those reactions, and just understanding where the industry is going and how we can adjust and make sure that we keep the organization safe, but at the same time agile, and making sure we don't become the blockers because it's compliance, if that makes any sense.
As a business owner, it's as though you went into my manual and said, what are the keywords that's really going to get Kristen motivated here? Like agile, operating structure, not typical terms that I'm having in a conversation with, say, an administrative HR leader versus a very strategic HR leader. And I can see it comes from that startup environment where you're putting the structure where they've got to be nothing but agile and be able to adjust while not have it be the wild, wild west, because nothing will kill a startup faster than not being in compliant or having different rules for different employees. So when you first walk into an organization and you're looking at, are the bones good? Do we have the frame in place? What are you looking for in that operating structure?
Well, there's a couple things. First, because I'm in technology, I'll take it a step back. When I go into any organization, the first thing I look for, and Typically, it's part of the interview process. They'll give me some type of, hey, put this strategy together. Here are our board documents, really understanding where they are from a technology perspective and understanding how viable the market fit, all of that fun stuff. Once you have that, then you can come in and really assess how clear is the strategy, what is currently in place. And typically, there's not, and in a startup, you're familiar, you can kind of run that way to 100, 200, and then it can cripple your business because everybody's involved in a decision. You cannot function at that level with everybody being involved in the business. So in business decisions. So it's really about tailoring the solution. There is no such thing as coming in and saying, I always think of, I'm sorry, I'm going to pivot, but I swear I bring it back. For any of us that are old enough to remember these behemoth ERP systems like SAP, you would come in, SAP was not configurable. You'd come in and you place this here and it works. And once you start configuring it, it got all crazy and wiry, right? We should never consider that as a solution in today's day and age. You have to come in and really understand where the business is going, what they're trying to achieve, and then build that operating model because it's going to look very different from a high growth to a slow growth. I don't want to say slow growth, but more steady growth. That's probably
Yeah, stable, steady. We call it incremental.
I love that.
You're hitting words that just absolutely resonate in every which way. You talked about a clear strategy, but you said first, I need to know where the business is going. What's the destination? Are we doubling in size in the next 3 years? Are we going after acquisition? Or are we doing incremental steady growth? Why does that matter so much to you?
Because it's going to frame the operating model. It's going to frame the organizational design. If you don't mind, I jump a little bit
Please.
on the organizational design. I think that's one place that just the world was so crazy. We were just throwing it together. We really weren't taking the time to think about, okay, where are we trying to go? What are the phases to achieve that? And this is really the time to do that. And that will set an organization up for success. So that's to me part of the operating model. But the way it differentiates, if you're looking for high growth, you need to stay agile and innovative. So you really need a more detailed operating model that's going to enable that. If it's going to be steady and slow, you need more of a framework. You don't have to get too crazy about that because you're not going to get to 500, 1,000 employees. So you want to keep that in mind because it's all about how do you unlock the ability of the organization. And that, like, I really feel strongly the operating model can do that, but it has to be customizable to what you're trying to achieve.
And as you're building that model and you're figuring out now who do we need to onboard? Who do we need that can grow with the organization and flex with it? Are you looking for very different types of individuals and how they think that can be good at this stage and grow? Or is it no, because we've got the model set up well, we don't have to be, we're not looking for the unicorns who can be the jack of all trades and just roll with it because that's a little more difficult to find nowadays.
It's really difficult. I think it's been difficult for some time, to be honest with you. Um, but I think when you have this situated, so if you don't mind, I'll use an example. There was a company that I was working for. They were developing ERP solution. It was starting with small business. They were in the auditing space, so highly compliant. There were several key things that I had to take into consideration. The CEO wanted longevity with this organization. This was something that he wanted to be proud of, but first and foremost, a legacy to provide and something that would continue on way past whatever involvement he had with the organization. They were very early stage, just getting their B series. So as a result of that, when we were thinking about the operating model, we did have to think, okay, what's going to unlock their ability to move fast, again, not be able to just add employees, but be strategic about the infrastructure, be aligned on the talent philosophy. But when it comes down to actually how do you build that talent, what we were very thoughtful on is, okay, well, what are the key people that have to report to the executive? And to your point, are you going to need to have that strategic mindset, but the tactical to help build it? And then where can you bring in those positions where they might come in more junior, but you could develop them to the C-suite? And I think that's really critical is having that balance. Because like you said, to bring in, I don't know, it all depends on the industry, right? You could bring in 5 executives, you could bring in 10 executives. To get those executives in who can think strategically and act tactical is practically impossible to find, right? So you just really have to balance it in making sure that you do bring in some of those pillars, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and when we're planning ahead like that, what we've seen is, yes, that's very difficult to find that individual who can think strategically, go and plan, and then enjoy the execution side of it. Is, do I need this expertise for this period of time to come in with the strategic, coach the rest of the team, decouple some of this, and just have an expert in this and an expert in that, and have more subject matter experts who are then executing on it versus, we're all looking at that unicorn. I need someone who can play every role right now. I can see how being strategic about that. And I love you just brought in, you had someone who was very intentional with the longevity. They
Yes.
wanted to build a legacy. I'm going to pick your brain a little bit here on the spot, and that's how you built that organization, the structure, the individuals, the roles. I don't think we always understand that that might be very different than if the CEO tells you, I'm looking to build it as much as I can in the next 5 years in order to sell to a strategic buyer or a private equity. Is your strategy and your game plan very different or somewhat aligned with a few differentiations?
No, I think it's aligned with a few differentiations. So say for example, a situation like this, what I would do is from an organizational design, really fixate on the experience that you're creating. So have an executive who's in charge of the customer experience, have an executive who's in charge of the employee experience, have an executive who's in charge of the product technical experience. And even within that, they're this way they have the ability to impact that full life cycle. But we even within that, this is where the differentiations come in. There are certain pieces that, for example, would go under go to market that I would intentionally encourage to go under tech. And the reason being is, and again, I'm going to reference, a complex tech SaaS platform. With that, in your go to market sector, you're going to need different groups that are highly technical and that are going to need to work very closely with engineering. So if you build the right infrastructure for retention, you can have them temporarily placed in that engineering department to build that connection so you don't have silos, build that technical capability, then bring it into the go to market function. Now you've built that gateway, right? So that's where I think I differentiate is understand the business well enough to say, okay, what are the areas that are going to bring up friction long term? And it's going to bring up issues with hiring and scaling long term. And how do we fix them upfront by being proactive?
Christina, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never seen friction between sales and engineering. Ever.
Never, never. They always get along so well.
Absolutely. It's the cross-functional teams. It's almost like that you're cross-training, but you're doing it very intentionally from here's the career path that you're going to go through, and you're giving them the foresight to do that.
Yes.
That's incredible. And you also talked about kind of the audience that's out there. You said we've got to have the operating structure and we've got to consider the audience of in the various stakeholders as we're
Yes.
putting this together. I would love to dive into that a little bit more because sometimes we get so caught up in our little bubble
Yes.
and or we just communicate, we put out there for one stakeholder and we forget. And the frustrating part is, but what about the three, four, five others?
Yes. And if you don't mind, I'll use performance management as an example to really hopefully hone in on what I'm talking about and
Mhm.
how to apply it. So, when you think about an organization, you have different groups within the organization and they learn differently. They put an emphasis on rewards differently. And oftentimes, I think, we often talk about the failure of performance management systems, and the failure comes when we think everybody is the same. And they're not. And granted, I'm going to make generalizations, so there's always exceptions, but for the most part, because you can't end up having 20 processes because you're going to make everything, you're going to take into consideration every exception, but it's important to address the majority. So in that, again, I'm going to make generalizations, but say for example, you're dealing with your go to market, your sales individuals, customer facing. These are people who are extrovert, if we want to put labels on it, typically they're ADD, they're quick, like give me the information, I want it quick, I want it synthesized, right? And they're going to be rewarded on their numbers, right? That's what they're looking for. And if you can create a program where they know coming in, where do I stand? How do I grow from a financial perspective? What's expected of me? What happens when I'm not meeting those? I mean, you make the lives of managers easy because you can, to a certain extent, go past all that formal pit because you have everything outlined and people know this is how I'm going to be rewarded. And that's how you start to build that high performance culture. Now, granted, the one thing that we can easily forget about and you can't, I should say, depends on the strategy. But again, this is where everything ties back to where you're trying to go. If you're like, hey, I want to get in, I want to make money, and we want to exit. Well, then you don't really care about the behaviors of your salespeople. You just want them to make money. But if you're in it for the long term, you're in it for an exit, behaviors become really critical, or you'll have a department full of jerks. No one else to put it,
Yes.
right? So that's
And we create it. We absolutely create it by the systems that we're putting into place and the culture we build around them 100%.
that's sales. Then, or I shouldn't just say sales, but that's customer go to market, customer facing. Then when you think of R&D, they're extremely different. R&D, typically the way I like to equate it, they think as an engineer. They think structured process. They want to know how each thing is going to move them forward, move them behind. So for them, a traditional performance management system with career ladders is really the way to go. Ensuring that you train them on feedback because that's not going to be their strength, and just adjusting your process and your rewards to that, making sure that things are detailed, they make sense, bringing them into the process. They're going to want to have a say and they're going to want to help in developing that. So, understanding, and not all are created equal, but for the most part, generalizing, that's how they're going to work. And understanding that and being able to communicate is going to be critical, especially when you think in the startup world where most founders are engineers. It's important to understand how they communicate, how they process information. Because I'll be honest, people like me, if I don't adjust myself, I will drive them insane. It's just the truth, right? So understanding personalities and all of that is critical. And then when you come to leadership, that's a different level as well too. When you're working with executives, again, being able to define, I think it's critical to be able to say, as a leadership team within the organization, these are the tenets we're going to follow. It becomes easy to build into a performance plan. And then most importantly, have the measurements. It's got to be quick for a CEO to take a look or an executive and say, is my senior leadership team performing? Are my executives? And having that built out. So it's like, yeah, I can see when something's going yellow. You don't want it to go to red. It's all about understanding when you're in the yellow and readjusting, if that makes sense. But that's how I say taking into consideration the different populations and adjusting. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And is you're saying that I love looking at patterns. And if I'm working with my R&D group, I'm working with my go-to-market, my marketing, my sales, and I have kind of some customization built in that. And I've got someone who maybe isn't fitting into that, and there is some friction. Is that a kind of a red or green flag to say, is it because maybe they would be better served in the go to market? And these frustrations and this friction is that, as much as they enjoy in the R&D, maybe they should be the conduit and the liaison between the two because they think this way, but behaviorally they want to be motivated this way. Or are they not a good fit for some other reason? Is that usually a sign?
I agree with you. It's usually a sign. And those are the people exactly to what you're saying. They can fit nicely into those pre-sales support roles where they need the technical capabilities, but they like they like the thrill of a sale and being part of that and have high EQ. So like you said, they're going to be rewarded differently. So sometimes that can be an indication that there's an opportunity elsewhere within. And the same for go to market, right? You'll have the people that really are struggling with that customer interface. Okay, well, maybe this is not the right fit. And, I think that's critical when assessing whether somebody is the right fit for the organization, understanding if they're just possibly in the wrong role.
What are some guidelines that you have in place? Because that's you're talking about this in a way that I can easily see it goes from here to there. But if our organization isn't set up for that interchangeability, or for those type of career identification, skill set, those conversations, what would be a good starting point to be able to walk in? You're an HR leader. So you're walking in on an interim basis, you're stepping in and you want to help them set up some career paths. You want to help them set up, be a little more agile with their workforce. What are some of the first steps you're putting in place to enable this?
Yeah. So for me, I'll be honest with you, whenever I go into an organization, the first and foremost thing I must do is focus on operations and creating that operational excellence and creating that infrastructure, right? So, like, for example, with career ladders, I often don't like to just say career ladders. It's an entire job architecture. What are you building? What are the levels within your organization? The compensation philosophy, and then that all builds to the career laddering. And with the career laddering, you don't want to go crazy. And now with AI, it can really allow you to go a lot faster, but it's keeping it simple. What are the specific, skill sets needed? And then where exactly, like you're saying, where is there a crossover? Where may somebody from engineering go into sales, vice versa, and being able to identify that so that that becomes a resource for leaders, right? And then when we're going in as HR business partners, we can truly coach them because now we have a roadmap, right? We can say, okay, well, and now everybody's in sync with what the opportunities are. Granted, we might identify new ones as we're going through it, and that's forever evolving. But I think it's critical before we can get to the strategic part, gotta have the basic operations down.
And through this, you and I speak one language. Go to market may speak another, leadership team may speak another. There's a lot of translating and a lot of communication. Just in looking at HR over the past couple of years, majority of the situations that we're brought into on an interim basis, it's involving either we don't have the right workforce, we're not retaining them, it's high turnover, or it's we don't know how to communicate. We have zero communication plan. And we're starting from scratch. They're bringing in a really high level strategic HR leader saying, what should we be communicating? Why are we communicating it? How are we doing this? Because leadership is spending so much of their time trying to figure out what to communicate or combating what was incorrectly communicating. And I'm
Correct.
sure that misalignment that I feel as though we spend more time fixing the problems that we unintentionally created than preventing them to begin with and solving for the right thing. What's the approach that you recommend taking or when you walk in to get that alignment of communication and translation?
Yeah, so there's several pieces to that. So the first thing is this is an area that should 100% be in the operating model, right? You should have a change management plan or risk management, like all of that should be built in and everybody on the same page on how that gets put out there. When it comes down to communication, this is where, to a certain extent, it may fall in several places because you have to be in a lot in alignment with how much transparency you want to offer. And from my perspective, I do like to be more transparent than less, but it's about letting people know what's happening. You don't, once, actually, let me take it all the way back. I'm forgetting a very key element of it. In order to have successful communication within the organization, there has to be trust. You have to establish that trust within leadership and with your employee base, because the truth of the matter is you're never going to be able to disclose everything, but the employees have to trust you enough that when you say, hey, this is what we're going to be doing, this is as much information as I can give you, they're like, oh, okay, you know what, Christina has always been transparent with me. I can trust that she has the right motivation ahead, and I can trust that she'll bring in the right people at the right time. And that's part of the communication plan. I think, oftentimes we always think of, all right, how is the leadership going to be aligned? But are you taking into consideration the pulse of the organization, what's happening on the ground? So when I create communication, any type of communication plan, it's like, okay, we'll start with the executives, senior leadership, and have a focus group. Have your employees be brought in sooner, like a group of them, so you can actually get real time what you may be missing. Because I can guarantee you, we all miss something, right? Because you're not
I
in that role. And that really helps solidify the clarity, the communication. And then also, to be honest with you, one of the things I rely on is AI, just simply because I'm going to speak like an HR professional. It is what I do, but it doesn't always translate to the larger audience. So it's putting it into AI and saying, hey, help me out. Like, this is the audience that I'm trying to speak to. Is this clear? Do I need to rephrase? And being able to adjust your messaging that way as well, too.
that feedback. I've got a saying: one way communication is dictation, two-way communication is communication is collaboration. And I was just listening to someone talk about a large strategic planning they did on a college campus, brought in individuals from all over. They laid out the priorities. They had their 6 things they were going to do next year for strategic planning. And he took it and he went around to just about everywhere on the campus and talked through them. And he said, you'd be amazed. He said, I talked to the grounds crew and it was a blank face. Like they had no idea what we were talking about. We had to go back to the drawing board.
Yeah,
Because if we're not taking into account the entire campus, and when we communicate this, we're doing it in a way where everyone will understand it, not just the employee groups represented in that meeting, we're not doing this right.
exactly.
I thought that feedback in that. And you mentioned the foundation is trust. My question, sometimes we live in a bubble and we think, well, of course we have trust in our organization. How do I get feedback on that? How do I know that my employees, they're not going to tell me? How do I know that our teams are going, okay, got it. Yep, understand it. I know that you're giving me all the information I can, and not turning around and going, they're hiding something.
And that's where, honestly, inclusivity, psychological safety becomes critical within an organization. And I'd love to say there's one way to address it, but it's very specific. It's going to be specific to potentially that leader, potentially that organization, and how they go about and rectify it. But that's going to be critical. If you build an organization where there is psychological safety and there is a feeling of belonging, inclusivity, then you're going to be able to have those open conversations. But it does take some training for leaders. And I'll be honest with you, it took me many years to be able to be okay with confrontation and people telling me how they feel. And, now I welcome it. Like, okay. And I'll actually intentionally go to the person who's going to give it to me first. I'm like, I know I'm
Wow.
probably going to walk out of there and it's going to hurt, but it's going to hurt for a reason, right? Because I'm going to get the truth. And that's really critical. And it does take coaching and developing for people to get there and be in that space that they can take it and realize it's not personal and be able to separate the two and action on it.
So you mentioned coaching and developing there. I don't know that I've ever seen a time in my 30, 40 plus years working, that I've seen such an emphasis and such a buy-in and investment in coaching and developing. Two of the most costly things we can do in a business: client acquisition and employee turnover, because we're trying to acquire talent as well. That emphasis on, I want to develop, I want to get ahead of the learning curve, I want to keep the people that we have. What are you seeing as really part of that driving it? Because we know what, of course you should be, of course this is it, but it's so difficult to know what we should be developing them on, that I think we get caught in that.
Yeah. So I think there's two pieces to your question. And if I go off and you're like, that's not, correct me and bring me back. The first thing is why the change? And I think the change is really being driven by the younger generations. I'm going to speak for myself. I came from the generation, do as I say, not as I do. You
Oh, yes.
we coming into the workforce, we didn't get guidance. You figured it out, right? There was very little mentorship. There was very little guidance. You jumped into the water and you pray you could swim, and you figured out what tools you needed and so forth. The younger generations are much smarter. And I'm not just saying that to say that, there's actually proof on it, and I won't go down that road. And
That's
they're
true.
coming in and they're saying, "Hey, no, I want to get the guidance. I need the guidance. I need the development." They're open to the feedback and they're really challenging many of us that came from that prior. And it's interesting to see, but I think it's a very, very good change that's needed. And then when you talk about the coaching and the development of it, I think sometimes where we go wrong is first and foremost, before we start any type of learning initiative or coaching or development, it's understanding where the person is from a mindset. Because I'll be honest with you, if you go in and they have a fixed mindset, you're not going anywhere. You first have to change that. That is most critical. And I'll be honest with you, if the person cannot get out of the fixed mindset, no coaching, no development is going to change that person. And that's a different conversation you have to have. But when you're going about that, I think that's probably the first and foremost important thing to do before you can get into any learning or coaching.
And we're seeing quite a bit more of the conversation. I've had employees come in, leaders come in and ask, you talk about that destination. Well, I'm going to build the operating model based on where this company wants to go. More and more, it's like, don't tell me what to do on a day-to-day basis. You don't need to task me. You don't need to, I need to know what needs to be accomplished. What's the outcome you need? And you talk a lot about that strategy and outcome and aligning the teams to that. And they really want to know where are we headed? You gotta don't give me a turn by turn directions here. Tell me where we're headed. Give me some idea. Help me with the skills that I'm lacking, and let me help figure this out. There seems to be this not like creativity, but wanting ownership on
Yes.
that destination. Are you seeing a shift in that as well is it generational or is it situational from the last couple of years?
I think it could be either, but it is a strong emphasis on generational. And you know what? I think, not that I think, one of the important things is for us to identify and realize what someone's potential is. And honestly, as leaders, I think that's a really big quality is understanding how much can you push them? How much can you challenge them and give them the leeway to make mistakes? Because that's how we all learn. I think that's probably one of the things that we all are almost like risk adverse, like, oh no, but and being able to take that accountability as that leader, but also making sure that's where one-on-ones become really critical, making sure that they know you are available for questions. I'll be honest with you, like my team, I've always worked with young team. And when I say young, from, whatever they're doing, they're young in their that particular stage of their profession, right? Doesn't mean necessarily age. And I make myself available. They know they can text me, they can know they can Slack me, they can call me. Depending on the urgency, do what you need to get in touch with me. And I'm here. I'm here to support you. I've done it before. I'll give you the guidance. But I really enable them to lead that conversation. And for the most part,
Mhm.
professionals do. They know when they need help. And as long as there's that safe place that they can go reach out and they know, hey, if I trip up, my leader's not going to go crazy. Instead, they're going to be supportive. That's a good thing, right? But really making sure that they feel comfortable. So again, it's always about catching it in the yellow, not the red, right? And making sure you have your safeguards. Now, if you're in a situation where, for example, I'm just going to throw compliance out there,
Mhm.
highly regulated, you can't, well, that's where you really work with them. You don't want to micromanage, but you want to make sure you stay very close to the process and you just help guide them. I think that's really the thing is as a leader, you have to understand that everybody's going to get to the end differently. If you're a leader and you want your team to just follow your process and not follow any other, you shouldn't be in a leadership role.
That's tough. Yep.
You have to be open to people getting there in their own way. Truth of the matter is, you're going to learn something from that, right? They'll learn from you, you'll learn from them, and potentially you build something greater.
We see that come a lot in second and third gen businesses when it's being transitioned from first gen to second gen and G2 to G3 or some type of succession planning. That's a tough thing that what got us here won't get us there, or it's someone else leading. They're not going to lead it in the same way. It just
No.
isn't natural to them to lead in that way and do things exactly that way.
Yeah, and that's always the hard part. When it's generational, It's you really have to think about that change management. That is gonna be crucial
Mhm.
because, if we take a step back, I think it doesn't even have to be, generational, movement. I think anytime somebody goes into something new, it's all of us just having respect for what's been there and going into that change management gradually. Ripping everything out and pretending that you know better is never going to move the needle forward. And the truth of the matter is, even in the biggest mess, there will be good. So being able to identify that good, that great, and then being able to fix the rest is going to enable that. Then that's really how you get people shifting. And granted, you're going to have your outliers that just don't want to change, and that unfortunately is going to lead to difficult conversations. But you really should go in with an open mind, and really manage that change effectively, if that makes any sense.
I hear it that turnaround CEOs run into that quite a bit. And they said, look, anytime I've got a couple of expert turnaround CEOs, and they get called after the company tried to turn around or a financial institution bought them, they get called in to then turn it around again. They said the biggest problem was they didn't respect the legacy. They didn't respect the heart of what got them there and then make tweaks around it or identify that one thing you talked about clarity, that one thing that we now need to make the center and focus of our attention and all decisions lead to that while keeping some of these other things that got us here in place. They just went in and tried to rip it out and remodel it. And it's impressive the not just the business acumen that they have, but that psychology behind that.
Yeah, and we've all been there to a certain extent. Those of us that have been in the industry, we've had somebody come in and it's hurtful. I don't care how open-minded you are. Somebody comes in and they come in with the thought, I got to prove myself. I know best. It just destroys morale, it destroys engagement. What's gonna happen? You're gonna have really key talent leave the organization, and most importantly, if it's a smaller organization, or even in a bigger organization, to be honest, you may lose, I apologize, that intellectual knowledge that no one else has. So, you're not gonna be able to progress without it, so it becomes such a key element to everything you said.
And we've talked about in the past cross mentoring between generations, and it's two-way. So you just mentioned going into organizations, they have something established there. You've talked about operating structures, and I know you have templates. We've talked about any number of things, and I know you've got a template that says here are all the components of an operating structure from how you hire to how you're organized to customer interactions, everything you want to, not that you have all the answers, but it's we need to answer all these questions. What happens when you're walking into a company where they really don't have an operating, they grew like most companies grow by the seat of their pants, making decisions as they go, not necessarily taking into account how do we handle the next $2 to $3 million of growth, or what do we look like in 5 million from now? How do you help evaluate and changing the wheels on the bus while the bus is barreling down the highway, uh, to put more of that structure and that operating model in place, taking into account where's that company going to? Do they want to be here 30 years? I just met a company, she said, we're 32 years old. I want to be here another 32 years. It could be the company's 32 years old. I want to sell in 3 years. Two very different situations. How are you adjusting and putting the components in place while it's still operating?
Yeah, and that's the tricky part. You really quickly, and in today's world, I use the word quickly. You really have to come in and understand the culture. Honestly, understand the trigger words. That's going to be critical when you're doing this. So, say for example, and I've lived through this where you know it's we don't want process. Process kills everything. So when you're implementing something like this, eliminate process and
Mhm.
instead maybe use a word like framework. And a lot of times the way you can actually move a lot of these changes is by understanding, again, like listening, understanding where they currently are, identifying, like you said, that critical part that you can really make an impact. Once you make that impact, then they're more receptive. And then it's like, oh, wait, you're right. Okay, what else can we do? And that's how you really open the door to longer conversations and really moving that needle. But I think one of the things that we make mistakes sometimes is we go in, we know what needs to be done, but we try to change it before we have that trust and that relationship established. So sometimes you have to understand the relationship, understand what you can have impact on, and as well as understand your verbiage. I don't there's not an organization, an executive team I've worked with that doesn't have trigger words. They all do. So identifying them and removing them from your vocabulary will allow you to like move faster.
And you've said one of those when everyone goes, don't say that word. That's a dirty word around here. You see the reaction in their faces because it was maybe not done in a safe way and they're traumatized by it. They really are.
That's exactly it.
So how do you find that safe way to have them feel comfortable? And a lot of this also, you know what that framework needs to look like, but you need them to build it. How are you
Exactly.
engaging them in that process?
There's a couple of pieces to it. First is making sure that you have the right team. First and foremost, right? And I know I mentioned this before, but it's even going back and making sure they
Mhm.
have the right mindset. Because if they don't have that growth mindset, they're not going to listen to any of this because it's like I know what to do. I don't need you. I don't need this playbook. And you could potentially even show them impact, and they might not. They might still might be like, oh no, because they can't get out of their own way. So I think number one, it's identifying and making sure that you have the right talent to take the organization forward. Once you have that right talent, then you can work. And again, it really depends on the team, the way they think, their past experience, and really adjusting the model so that you can have impact. And sometimes it's teams that they're eager for it. They're like, yes, and they jump all in and that's amazing. But that, to be honest with you, is the exception rather than the rule. And then it's, assessing how can I really make impactful change here and get them to build that trust with me so that they understand, yeah, you know what, in particular in my role, it's mostly them trusting that, okay, she's bigger than HR. She really does understand the business and she understands how this is all put together. And, we have to do that fast, but we have to do that thoughtfully so that we can then start making those changes. But again, and I'm sorry I'm being repetitive, it goes back to that change
Absolutely.
management approach, and just making sure that you're thoughtful in your interactions, you're thoughtful in where you decide to implement that change, and seeing where the team is on your journey. And when they're there, that's amazing. You can run, but you often got to get them there.
It comes up a lot in conversations, and I don't think that we can ever overuse or over talk about the transition from what used to be our superpowers of transformation and change management and agility is now a muscle that needs to be in every organization, even if the company's just looking for incremental growth. I think the outside environment and the workforce itself is going to force that evolution. And we've got to be able to adapt with some type of guardrails or some type of framework in place for how are we going to manage through that? How are we going to introduce change? How are we going to decide on how we will make that change? It's
Exactly.
amazing those conversations that you go through. Christine, what would be we've talked through a number of areas of operating. You said the first thing I do is I go and I focus on operations and the operating model and what we have in place. It can be overwhelming, especially for a leader who's so used to running the day to day of the business. What would be kind of your first one or two steps or pieces of advice to either look in and recognize, do I need to do this? I don't want to do things just for the sake of doing things. Is this going to help my business? Or did we intuitively do this to begin with? How am I evaluating that and how I can take some nuggets from what you're saying today and really thoughtfully look at it and say, can this help my business?
First and foremost, you got to stop everything you're doing. You really need to give yourself the space to think through. And yes, again, you can't take months on ends to figure this out, but stop. Stop what you're doing. Take a look at the strategy. Make sure you have all the answers on where's the business headed, what is the strategy, what's the vision, and then reassess and understand like, okay, what do we really need to do to unlock the talent of our organization? Because that's what's going to make us successful. And I think oftentimes you just get caught in the craziness and the chaos that you forget to take a moment and just think through that. And you really need like maybe a day or two with no interruptions. And yes, it's hard when you're running really, really fast to give yourself that space. There's no other way that you're going to be able to give your, like, really think through something carefully without giving yourself that space. Otherwise, you're just a hamster on a wheel and you're going to continue to run that way and nobody wins.
And I love and step back, take the advice that you gave earlier, get feedback.
Yes.
Does this make sense? Does
Yeah.
it, is it understandable? Isn't doable? Because I can come up with some really good vision out there. It just may or may not be doable. What there might be some incremental, or you talked about milestones in that operating model in order to get there. Christine, thank you. I can tell that you have absolutely got a methodology and you've made a career of helping companies figure out how do we operationally set you up for success, because if that is in place, the people part we can manage, we can do that, we can support them, we can help them, but we've got to have the foundation and those clear guidelines, guardrails. They need to know when if they do this they're going to go off the cliff versus when we're just maybe deviating between the lines.
Exactly.
Hi, Kristen. Thank you for all of your advice, and I look forward to more in the future. In fact, we've got to do, I think we need to do a separate, just HR leadership episode on that business partnership, that the HR, more of that organizational design and that operating infrastructure. I think that would be tremendous to really dive into implementing an operational system in what would work for the organization based on what destination they get to.
Exactly, exactly,
I love
building
it.
that playbook.
Fantastic. Well, until next time, and I'm sure that we will see each other again. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.